The smoke hit him first, a rasping bloom that tasted of iron and rainless skies. Sergeant Renard Calder, coded among the line as C209, a whisper to the men who trusted him more than their own breaths, felt a hammering in his chest where the bullet had lodged. The stars and stripes billowed above him, a stubborn flame in a gale, and the rifle smoke stitched a curtain across the sun. In that moment, the flag was more than cloth. It was a compass, a promise, a line drawn in courage and fear. The confusion parted and returned like a tide, the drummer barking a cadence, the muskets coughing and singing with white smoke, the shouted orders that never seemed to reach the ears exactly as spoken. Calder's hands found the flag's stout saltwood staff, slick with rain and something darker. 5 holes bloomed through his coat at angles that spoke of the enemy's aim and of the field's brutal geometry. He did not flinch. He could not. "Hold fast, Calder," a voice rasped in his ear, not loud so as to betray the anxiety beneath it, but steady as a rope pulled taut. Major Ellsworth's silhouette appeared at the edge of his perception, a presence that carried a different weight when the world tilted around it. Calder did not look away from the flag. He spoke to it as if to a stubborn old friend, one who had seen better weather but would never abandon him in a storm. "Stay with me, old girl," he whispered, the words tasting like old copper and hope. The enemy surged again, a black wave of murky uniforms and louder promises to break what the Union bled to hold. The ground sprang with the sounds of boots cracking into frozen mud, the wet slap of a bayonet freed from its scabbard, the dull thud of a solid shot meeting a half-broken shield of resolve. Calder's breath came in catches. The flag's fabric rasped against his shirt, the fibers catching on his wound, pulling a line of heat across his chest that made the world narrow to a pinpoint of pain and color. "Lieutenant, the color," someone shouted. A man who wore the look of someone who had learned to count the cost and still choose to stand. "Not yet," Calder said, and it wasn't just refusal to yield. It was a vow etched into skin and sinew. He pressed the flag closer against his body, as if trying to fuse himself to the symbol, to braid his own blood to its stripes until the storm wore itself out. The moment cracked like a dry branch under pressure. A second volley clipped the air, and with it a scream, short, sharp, human, rising from a cluster of men behind him. Calder's vision blurred at the edges. His left leg buckled, the boot sinking, then dragging in the slick earth as if it were the sea dragging a ship toward a reef. The 5th bullet, there were 5 in him, found its mark in the shoulder, a red, bright wound that sang with a strange, almost musical sting. Yet the flag never faltered. It rose and fell with Calder's breathing, a stubborn pulse against his ribs. He pressed his teeth into his lip to keep the scream from erupting into the air, afraid the sound would betray what he knew only he could see, the line thinning, the gap widening, the fear turning to a kind of fierce, quiet despair. "Renard," a voice said, and there was a touch of awe in it, like someone who sees a man walk into a raging storm and chooses to walk with him anyway. Calder found the strength to straighten. He would not go down yet. The unit needed the sight of him, the way a mile eats men, but a flag can lift them back toward a dawn they cannot yet name. The ground beneath his boots was slick with rain and the half-melted ice of fear, with the taste of rusted metal on the tongue, and the bite of cold air that seemed to burn the lungs. A hand reached out, rough as a burlap sack, yet surprisingly gentle in its grip. A private, young with dirt on his cheeks and a stubborn curl of hair that wouldn't lie flat, stood at Calder's side, shoulder to shoulder, the boy's rifle held almost as an afterthought. He spoke in a brittle whisper, words that sounded like they were torn from a book the boy hadn't quite finished reading. "Sir, we can pull you back." "We can back?" Calder's mouth twisted into something that wasn't a smile. "Back's where the ground tells us to lie down. Back's what the line claims when it thinks no one is looking. We go forward, or we sing the last breath and hope the wind learns the words." The private's eyes widened, not with fear but with something almost sacred, recognition that Calder was asking him to share a burden more than to endure a command. "Then we go," the private said, though the tremor in his voice betrayed how heavy those words felt. "Careful," Calder replied, his voice a thread of iron. "Careful with the flag. It's heavier with the heart of a nation behind it than you can see with these eyes. And I'll carry it if you'll shoulder the line with me." Another soldier, this one older with a scar along his jaw that didn't seem to bother him much when he spoke, leaned into Calder's other side. "C209, he murmured, almost in awe, and the nickname stuck to Calder's tongue again as if it had never left. "A 9 is just a number," Calder said, more to remind himself than to claim anything for the ears around him. "The name is Calder, Sergeant Calder." A chorus of agreement answered him from the line behind them, a murmur that felt like a rope being wound tight around a stubborn post. Calder's fingers found the flag's edge, the cotton rough against his skin, where the blood already painted his shirt. He pulled, a slow, deliberate movement that confirmed his intent to retreat with something that mattered more than life in its ordinary sense. The plan formed in moments: an improvised withdrawal, a countercharge leave, a 200-meter drag across ground that ran slick and cruel with rain, and the memory of all the battles that had carved such paths into this land. The world around them was a furnace of noise, yet Calder heard only two sounds: the flag's quiet rasp when the wind shifted, and the wet whisper of his own heartbeat told him how close the next breath would come. "Move with me," Calder told the private, and in that order there was a promise and a risk, a call to both fear and trust. They moved as if in a game of chess played on a field that kept shifting its rules. The private watched Calder's back as if watching a cliff face, every step a decision, every dune a possible trap. The flag pressed against Calder's chest, its edges catching on his wounds, drawing a sting that felt like a dragon's kiss. Around them, the battle surged and receded in irregular gulps, as if the ground itself exiliously breathed with the charge of the fight. The smoke thinned, then thickened again, creating moments of eerie light that turned the flags on both sides into specters, thin, fluttering shapes that seemed almost to whisper the names of the fallen, then vanish when a gust hit. "Steady," someone barked. Not at Calder, but at the entire front. A command carried on a wind that could have been the breath of a horse or the breath of God, or perhaps just the world's way of saying enough. The retreat began in earnest, with Calder taking the first measured steps, the private close enough to lean in and take on any stray drift of weight the curse of a bullet still demanded. Calder's left shoulder burned with a fire that wasn't just pain, but a story of what had to be borne to keep the line intact. His legs protested with each contact they made with the frozen mud, but the flag's weight, both physical and symbolic, held him in a gravity that mattered more than gravity. "Steady, Calder," the older soldier repeated, now a steadying anchor rather than a voice of command. His name didn't matter to the wind. What mattered was that he stood with Calder and did not waver. Calder did not respond with words, because every breath carried a piece of the world's memory. His mother's lullaby sung long ago in a dusty kitchen, the image of a free field that wasn't a dream, but a promise his people had learned to offer to the men who would carry it forward. He pictured his mother's face, severe with pride, as if to say, "You will be more than what you were born to be. You will choose this day to be the shield for those who cannot shield themselves." The line began to move back in a staggered rhythm. It was not a parade's discipline, but a stubborn, grudging march towards something that felt almost like safety, and yet was not that at all. Calder's mind drifted for a heartbeat, then snapped back with the ache of a new wound, this time listening to the way the fabric pulled against his body, the sound of it tearing ever so slightly as the weight shifted with each deliberate step. "Tell me about the line," a voice called from behind him, a scholar's curiosity wrapped in the soldier's fear. It belonged to a young lieutenant who wore his uniform with a seriousness that suggested he hadn't yet learned how to contain his awe. Calder did not trust his memory to hold the tale long enough for a straight answer, but he gave the truth as he understood it in the moment. "The line isn't a line at all, Lieutenant. It's a breath. When it holds, we breathe. When it breaks, we choke on the mud and the smoke and the silence that follows." The lieutenant nodded, as if that simple, broken truth might become a weapon in itself. He opened his mouth to speak again, then closed it, choosing instead to listen. The two men moved in cadence with the others, and the flag itself rode their combined motion, a living flagellum of history that refused to touch the ground. From the corner of his eye, Calder saw a Confederate line collapse in a corner of the field, an effect of the retreat, a momentary distraction that allowed a few steps of progress. A gust pressed against the flag's edge, and the stripes raked across Calder's wounded chest in a rough kiss that made him wince, but not falter. The count of the distance mattered only to the men who could measure it with their feet and their fear. 100 meters, 150, 200. The ground finally felt less hostile, as if the field itself remembered its shared duty to the living, and granted them a reprieve enough to coax the heart back from the edge of a ruin it could not yet see. "Easy now," the private murmured, offering a hand that barely trembled with the tremor in his own chest. "We're getting there." "Not there yet," Calder replied, with a dryness that surprised him, a voice that hadn't learned to waver yet in the face of ennobling pain. "We're getting to a line that will hold." A moment later, a smoke-dusted silhouette appeared ahead. The silhouette of a sandbag parapet, the kind that only a few yards of earth and a handful of fear could create. It wasn't a grand position. It was a workman's fortification, a stubborn obstinacy against the tide. Calder's feet knew the path even if his eyes refused to name it. The private's shoulder pressed against his, steadying the wobble in Calder's gait, and together they threaded the last few steps toward the parapet's shelter. As they reached the edge of concealment, a chorus of rough exhalations rose from the men behind them, a human exhale that sounded like a sudden understanding, that skin and bone and nerve and will could be pressed to the edge and still live to tell the tale. Calder's breath came in a series of shallow, aching gasps. He lowered the flag slowly, twisting it a fraction so that the stripes remained upright, a ceremonial posture in a field that had forgotten ceremony and remembered only survival. The moment stretched, and for an instant there was nothing but the wind and the flag and the quiet crackle of distant fires. Then the voices returned, voices that spoke to him with a gravity that wasn't cruel but honest. The private's whisper found its way into Calder's ear again. "Sir, you're a brave man," the private said, not to flatter but to acknowledge the gravity of the act just performed. Bravery, Calder thought, was not something you wore like a badge. It was something that wore you, like a coat that grew heavier with each season you wore it. He looked at the flag, saw the way the light struck its fabric. He saw the blood that coated his chest like paint that refused to dry. He saw the line behind him, the men who stood and would stand again because the sight of that flag stirred something ancient in their chests, something old and stubborn and true. "Bravery is doctrine without an instructor," Calder replied, his tone soft, almost confessional. "It is not the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward when fear knows your name." The major, who had emerged from the smoke with a look that seemed to blend relief with grim resolve, stepped closer to the parapet. He was a man who had seen more than any lifetimes of battles could have offered. His eyes carried the weight of a ledger that kept track of every life saved and every life sacrificed. "You're a stubborn man, Calder," he said, the words measured, almost gentle in their gravity. "You've dragged a flag, you've carried a line, you've kept a promise the country has yet to name properly. We'll tend to your wounds, and tomorrow we'll need your breath again." Calder did not respond with bravado. He glanced at the private again, who wore a look of stubborn pride that reminded Calder of the evenings he'd spent as a boy, watching his mother sew a shirt for a neighbor with holes just where the cold crept in. He saw in the private's expression the same quiet vow that had drawn him to the flag in the first place, to risk everything so that the line would stay true, so that the ground would not swallow the memory of what they carried. The flag's fabric rested on a gun rack near the parapet, the weight of it balanced by the equipment stacked along the wall. The air smelled of damp earth, burned powder, and something sweeter that hung in the back of Calder's throat, a memory of his grandmother's kitchen, the kind of scent that makes time feel tangible, a thread you can tug to a different life. His skin prickled with the awareness that he did not belong to this field or to this era alone. He belonged to every person who had ever believed that a nation could endure, because a single man, or a single color of cloth, refused to break. The retreat had become a victory of another sort, an act of reverence for a symbol that had been tested in fire and kept intact. Yet the wounds spoke in a language of their own, and the blood on his chest told him a more personal story than any battle map could ever record. "Sir," the young lieutenant asked again, this time with a careful curiosity rather than awe, "what happens now?" Calder faced him, the heat of the moment still clinging to the muscles of his shoulders and arms. He spoke with the gravity of one who understands that every decision now will ripple outward in places he cannot see. "Now we breathe," he said, almost as a prayer. "We mend. We hold this line as long as the ground gives us a reason to. And if the ground forgets, we remind it with the sound of our feet and the weight of this flag." The flag, a stubborn living thing in Calder's hands, dipped and then rose again in a small, victorious twist. The war would not end in that moment, nor would its memory be sealed by this single act. But in the eyes of the men around him, Calder saw a pledge that would outlast the day's smoke, the pledge to tell the truth of what they'd walked through, even if the telling would have to wait for a longer, harder peace. Night began to gather with a slow, patient hand. The fires along the line burned low, their orange tongues licking the air with a silence that was almost holy. The grass was slick with dew, the earth cold under Calder's boots, the sting of his injuries a constant rasping companion. The flag lay across the parapet, a sentinel that would not sleep, a banner that would hold every memory the men poured into it. The private, who had stood with his hands on his rifle all this time, finally spoke again, the words measured, almost ceremonial in their tone. "Sir, will the world ever know what you did today?" Calder tilted his head toward the open night, toward the sky that was already taking on the first pale blue of dawn's promise, and offered a truth not as a boast but as a vow. "Maybe not in my lifetime," he admitted softly, "but somewhere someone will tell a story about this day, about a flag that wouldn't fall and a man who wouldn't give up, even when he was taught to fear more than he loved. If they tell it honestly, it will be enough." A bell-like sound of distant artillery whispered through the field, a reminder that the night was not yet done with them. The major raised a hand, and the men settled into loose, watchful clusters, the flag still lifted, and Calder's body telling him that the rank of pain had not snagged him yet from the burden of duty. The hours rolled on with the slow patience of a humoured giant. The world woke with a chill that ran through the air like a current, turning breath into visible, white-roped strings that broke and vanished before you could count them. Calder's hands found the flag again, the fabric coarse and honest against his skin, and he ran his fingers along the edge as if tracing the river's course in a map someone else had drawn long ago. A memory pressed at the edges of his mind. His mother, who had taught him to read by lamplight from a battered Bible. The same words she had saved for him from the day his father's fate had taught him what it meant to be a man who carried a burden not of his choosing. He thought of the woman who had escaped slavery's shadow and carved out a small stubborn life for her child, stitching across the country's rough cadences with a thread of unyielding hope. He thought of the future, the way a child's laughter could sound in a quiet yard, if only the world would hold its breath long enough for that moment to arrive. Morning light found him where he stood, a man still preserving something sacred through sheer will and stubborn heart. The men about him moved with the slow mercy of those who have learned that the world will not bend to their need, but they can bend it with enough stubborn, chosen courage. "Sir," a new voice spoke, this one softer, almost cautious, "the surgeons say you'll live, but not without a long road of healing." Calder turned his head slightly toward the speaker, a medical orderly who wore sweat and fear like a second skin. The man's eyes held an unspoken question. "What do you do with a man who has already done what others would call impossible?" "We fix what's broken and we hold what's sacred," Calder replied, the words simple but carrying a weight that no man could mistake. "Tell them to remove the shrapnel and to bring the news that the flag's still theirs to claim." The orderly nodded, the ache in his own posture softened by a shared purpose. He moved away to coordinate with the wagons and the field surgeons, who would begin the work of stitching the wounds in Calder's chest and shoulder, a process that would take time and patience, and a kind of stubborn heartbeat that refused to yield to despair. As the day continued to wake, Calder found a quiet moment on the parapet, the flag across his lap now, the fabric cooling in the morning air and the last embers of night flickering at the corners of the field. The private sat beside him, elbows on knees, eyes forward, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. "Why the flag?" the private asked, almost to himself. But Calder heard him and answered with a line that he hoped would anchor the boy when the fear returned. "Because the flag holds a nation's memory in its folds," Calder said, not with lecturing bravado, but with the tone of a man who had learned the hard way what it cost to forget. "It's not a garment or an emblem. It's a memory that asks to be kept, if we're to keep walking into the future." The private turned toward him, studying Calder with the seriousness of a student who finally trusts the teacher enough to ask the hard question the class had never dared pose aloud. "Do you think about home when you're holding it?" "Always," Calder admitted. The word tasted like ash and rain, but honesty was a currency he could afford to spend here, among men who understood that a home was not a place, but a promise kept by the living. "Home is every name you've forgotten, because you thought you'd never need to remember it again. It's every quiet night that makes you stand again when you'd rather sleep. The private looked past Calder, beyond the flag and toward the horizon, where smoke still clung to the air like a stubborn memory. He spoke with a reverence that hadn't yet learned to soften. "Your wife, your daughter, do you have them?" Calder's breath hitched in a way that was almost a physical thing, a release of all the fear he had learned to cradle in his chest. He did not answer with information. He answered with a reflection that felt like a confession and a blessing at once. "I have a future I'm fighting to shape," he said at last. "If there's a future worth having, it's worth fighting for with both hands and a flag that will not fall." The day wore on, and the field grew louder with the day's work, the clanging of tools, the careful movements of surgeons, the soft counsel of nurses who kept voices quiet and hands gentle, even as the world around them roared with the memory of the day's events. Calder's body received the care it needed, and his soul found a strange, stubborn peace in the rhythm of the routine that followed catastrophe. As the afternoon faded, a courier rode up from the next ridge with a message, a single sheet of parchment bearing the seal that had somehow found him even here, in the middle of a world that hadn't yet learned to be kind to the brave. The paper bore simple words, but their weight pressed against Calder like another wound, the kind that doesn't bleed but changes you forever. The Union line held, the soldiers were steeped in the work of healing, and the flag remained as if it had learned from Calder's stubborn courage to carry more light into the future than any man could deliver with a handful of gunpowder. The day closed not with a triumph, but with a quiet, reverent hush. The men drifted toward their tents, some speaking softly to one another, others sharing a look that said more than speech could ever convey. Calder lay back on a rough cot, the flag tucked carefully near his side, its edge catching the last amber glow of the sun that slid over the field and settled into the kind of twilight that makes memories clear and choices sharper. His gaze drifted to the sky, where a few stubborn stars had begun to glitter through the thinning smoke. The memory of home pressed closer, as if the night itself offered a lullaby and a challenge all at once. He thought of his mother's hands guiding him to learn to read, despite the world's insistence that a black boy could not know his letters, and of the way she used to tell him that signs and symbols were more powerful than chains if only a person learned to see them. A soft voice interrupted his reverie, the voice of the nurse whose gentle hands had found a way to make the most painful routines feel almost like, "Mercy, you've earned rest, sir," she said, a quiet firmness in her tone that didn't pretend the work was finished, only that it paused for a moment to honor what had been done. Calder looked at her, not with the hardness a battlefield can forge, but with gratitude that hardened over weeks and months, in the company of those he trusted to believe in him, when belief itself seemed a fragile ember. "Thank you," he whispered, not asking for more than the right to wake tomorrow and do the same work again if that is what is required to keep the line from breaking and the flag from touching the ground. The nurse gave him a small smile, not of pity but of shared resilience. She moved away, and Calder enveloped himself in the quiet of the room, the soft rasp of the flag's fabric as it settled into a resting position near his bed, a constant reminder of the day's truth. In the stillness that followed, the field outside his window breathed with a calm that felt almost sacred, a counterpoint to the chaos that had defined it for the better part of a day. Calder's eyes drifted to a slab of pale moonlight that stretched across the floor, and in that silver glow, he found a silhouette of a future he had not yet dared to imagine. The last thought of the night came as a soft, almost light-hearted confession, something only a man who has carried the weight of a nation on his chest could admit and survive. If he survived this day, perhaps there would be a morning where the flag would be seen, not as a symbol of war's desperation, but as a sign of a country's capacity to endure, to forgive its own missteps, and to celebrate the stubborn truth that a single night's courage can anchor a generation to a dawn worth waking for. And so the night held him, a sentinel watching a dawn he hoped would arrive not as a spectacle, but as a quiet, shared renewal of faith, that the line would hold, that the flag would be kept from falling, and that the memory of this day would be taught not as a tale of blood and bravado alone, but as a testament to the living human heart, its fragility, its stubbornness.